I have a natural reaction anytime I see the hype train get going to really question if the products being talked about in that hype are actually as good as they're meant to be, or if it's just a matter that a few people have said how good it is and then others have jumped on that bandwagon and continued that theme. Sometimes the hype train is very real and deserved, other times it's a one-way ticket to disappointment and wasted money. Let's find out which is which as we take a look at the Holo Spring and the Holo May KTE versions. Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Before I jump into the review, I'd just like to remind you about my challenge to get to 20,000 subscribers here on Passion for Sound. As soon as we reach 20,000 subscribers, I'm going to be giving away the SMSL SU8S and SH8S as a stack. So you have a chance to win a $600 desktop audiophile DAC and amp combo just by helping me get to 20,000 subscribers. So please find your favorite video from the channel. If it's this one, that's fine. Share it anywhere that you can, anywhere that you're happy to. It might be audio forums, social media. It might be just telling a friend, sending a text message with the link, whatever you want to do. But the sooner Passion for Sound gets to 20,000 subscribers, the sooner I can give away the SU8S and SH8S combo. As always, thank you for all your support and let's get on with the review. One more thing before I get into the review is I want to say a huge thanks to Hugo from Indie Hi-Fi. Hugo's been kind enough to loan me the Spring and the May for an extended period of time. I've had them for a few weeks now, so it's given me lots of chance to play with them with all different setups, different amplifiers, different inputs, different configurations. So thank you, Hugo, for making this review possible. As always, I'll put a link down below through to Hugo's store. So if you're in Australia and you're thinking about buying either the Spring or the May, do please click through to Hugo and supporting a great Australian audio business. Even though I'm sitting here resting on the Holo May KTE DAC, I do also have here the Holo Spring Level 3 KTE as part of this review. So what I'm going to look at today is the Spring KTE, the May KTE. I'm going to explain what KTE is all about in a moment and work out where they stack up by comparing them to other DACs like the Schiit Yggdrasil, the current OG version, and also the Hugo TT2 and the Hugo TT2 with the M scaler attached. So there's lots of ground to cover, and with that in mind, I'm going to summarize some of the design and usability features that are common to both the Spring and the May in the opening here, and then I'm going to dive into the detail about the sound by doing some comparisons. And I want to start with a conversation about the size, the design, and the features of these DACs. So both the Spring and the May are large DACs. These are significantly wider than a big DAC like the Schiit Yggdrasil, so they take up a lot of space. For some people that's not going to be an issue, but for me, being all desk bound here, it was a big issue trying to fit this in on my desk. When you go to the May, you're actually getting even more space taken up by this separate power supply unit. And that leads us to a bit of a discussion about the differences between the Spring and the May. Both of these DACs are R2R ladder style DACs, meaning that they use a series of resistors to calculate the output analog signal from the incoming digital signal. What separates these two is that the Spring, which is the lower level unit, uses a fairly traditional stereo style setup. It does still produce a balanced output, but it does it with a stereo style circuit. And what I mean by that is best understood when you compare it to the May. The May uses two completely distinct circuits for the left and the right channels, and that theoretically should provide for better detail resolution, better separation of the channels, and therefore better imaging and spatial details. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the two of them being done a bit differently. This is a fully discrete, like a twin mono setup you could call it, versus a stereo setup in the Spring. On top of that, as I've already mentioned, the May has a separate power supply unit that's here, whereas in the Spring, the transformers and everything are built inside the Spring DAC. So the Spring looks identical to the May in most ways, in the sense that it looks just like this top DAC here, without the bottom unit. The dimensions of the May DAC section and the Spring are identical. The display positioning is identical. Some of the buttons are different between the May and the Spring, but beyond that, they're almost indistinguishable from the front, and it's only when you look at the back that things are really obvious that things are different. Before I deep dive into the connections and the layout of the back, let me quickly cover off pricing on these. The Spring comes in, as I have it here in the KTE version, at $3,098 US, or technically the one I have here has a preamp module added to it, which gives you volume control, and that means it's $3,698. So it's $600 extra for that preamp. The May, on the other hand, is a $5,598 US DAC, so it's a significant investment in a DAC, and it doesn't have any preamp capabilities because Holo Audio make an entirely separate preamp that's designed for those that want the absolute maximum sound quality. So on one hand, it may feel like a negative that you're paying more for the May and you can't get the preamp built in, but I believe it's all done to maximize potential sound quality on the assumption that if you're going to this level, you're going to want to go all the way. The other piece I should quickly cover off is I keep talking about this KTE thing. With the Spring and the May, they come in different levels of product. And basically, as you're moving up through the levels, you're getting upgraded parts like capacitors, the internal wiring is different, there are little bits and pieces that change to improve the sound quality of the device. They're not going to be drastic changes that completely transform what I'm going to say here. So if you were to buy level 2 of the Spring or the May, it's going to be roughly similar to what I'm describing, but there might be some subtle differences. The KTE version stands for the Kitsune Tuned Edition, and that's referring, as I understand it, to the main distributors as opposed to the Holo brand itself. I'm not entirely sure of the relationship there, but it's kind of a bit like buying an AMG version of a Mercedes, where a specific company has looked at how to upgrade certain specific parts within the product to get what they believe is the maximum quality sound. So everything I'm going to be talking about here today does refer to the Kitsune or the KTE versions of the Spring and the May, which is the top of the range and therefore the most expensive versions. With all that out of the way, let me turn around this beast and have a look at the back. There's no denying when you first see, and then definitely when you feel in terms of picking up and handling these DACs, that they are spectacularly made, at least on the outside. Now, one thing I should mention at this point is I'm not going to cover the individual circuit design on the inside. I've seen a few great reviews of these DACs that go into detail about the internal circuitry, about the precision involved in how they've used an additional ladder to help offset the inaccuracies of the standard decoding ladders in here. There's lots of great information out there, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. I do recommend, if you want to know more about how these are working, that you go and check out some of those other reviews. Instead, I want to focus on the sound quality, but I do also want to cover off the features and functions of these, just in case you don't want to go see those reviews for the internal details, but you do want to understand what these are capable of. Looking at the back panel of the May here, there's one key difference compared to when you look at the Spring. And that is, as you can see, that we've got the outputs on either side of the chassis. Much like the recent review of the Burst & Soloist GT, which is sitting down here on my desk, this is a sign of the fact that you've got two completely independent or discrete circuits running for the left and the right channels. So in the case of the May, you've got the outputs on each side, so you've got a pair of XLR sockets and a pair of RCA sockets. Whereas in the case of the Spring, these are closer together because they're being handled by a single stereo circuit. And we'll get to the impact that has on the sound soon, but that's really the key difference when you look at the back of these. One other thing that does separate them though is this little connector here. This is for the power cable that runs into the May from the separate power supply unit, and it's this snake of a cable here. So it's a big beefy cable, it's got a multi-pin connector that you can see there, and that carries the power from the separate power supply up into the May. In the case of the Spring DAC, it has a mains connector over on the side because, as I mentioned before, all the power supply is built into the DAC itself. As for the benefits of the separate power supply, in part it's about producing extra space so they can have those duplicated twin circuits in here, but in theory it might also help to isolate some of the noise coming from the toroidal transformers in there and prevent it from affecting the sound quality of the DAC. Before we deep dive into sound quality though, let's finish talking about the connections available on both the Spring and the May, because both of them have the same set of inputs and outputs. And that means you can run SPDIF in the form of coaxial or BNC, you can run optical, AES, I2S, and of course USB. So it's a fully featured DAC in terms of inputs, whether you're buying the Spring or the May. I did some testing of the various inputs from a sound quality point of view, and keeping in mind that each of the protocols has its own way of processing the sound, talking about optical versus SPDIF versus USB for instance. And then of course the cables are different too, whether or not you believe in cables making a difference. There's lots of variables, which means that it's very difficult to say that all the inputs work exactly the same as each other. Certainly for me, I would say the differences weren't significant enough that I would say one was specifically better than the other. In other words, I believe you can buy a Spring or a May and comfortably use any of the inputs, no problems at all. Coming back around to the front of the device, and depending on the unit that you have, you've got a range of buttons on the front that do things like mute the output, change the oversampling mode, I'll talk about that in a second, allow you to switch off the display so it's only coming on when you're interacting with the DAC, and then it switches off to remove any potential noise it might produce. And then in the case of the May, you've got a source switch. In the case of the Spring, you've got volume up and down. So they do work slightly differently in terms of which buttons you have, but the functionality is identical. It's just accessed slightly different ways. There's also a really nice CNC milled aluminium remote control, and it's the same remote control for both DACs, once again demonstrating that functionality is essentially identical between the two. One other thing worth noting is there are a few features that you can change via access to an additional menu, and that's accessed by switching off the device, holding down the menu button, and switching it back on. That will let you turn off things like the phase lock loop, which helps to reduce jitter, and also will allow you to change things like the pinout for the HDMI connection for I2S. So they're not things you're going to really need to get into very much. You should really leave the phase lock loop on. It does make a good improvement. And once you've set up the I2S, if you're using it, you don't really need to touch it again. So I don't mind that menu's hidden because there's not anything specifically necessary in that menu for day-to-day use. The display on both DACs is a really nice white LED, and it produces a very clean, clear interface that shows you everything you need to know. It shows you volume levels on the Spring if you've got the preamp module installed, and otherwise it shows you the sample rate most of the time, and also your oversampling and your source information. And so now's probably a good time to talk about oversampling. These DACs, despite being R2R, are fully DSD capable. They can handle high sample rate PCM, as well as of course standard PCM, but they'll go all the way up into your 300 and 700 kHz plus ranges, as well as doing DSD. All of those signals are handled by R2R systems, although the DSD, as I understand it, is handled by a separate R2R board. But the key thing is it's all being handled the same way, and therefore the sound quality is consistent, albeit a little bit different, I'll get to that soon, depending on the sample rate you feed it. That also means though that the DAC is capable of providing oversampling should you want it. And it does it in a couple of ways. So you can have it in non-oversampling mode, which I agree with everyone else that I've seen talk about this. Non-oversampling mode is definitely the best choice. But should you want to, you can also change it into oversampling mode, which will essentially oversample DSD higher or PCM higher. Or you can have it in PCM oversampling, which will turn everything into high sample rate PCM. Or you can have it in DSD oversampling mode, which will turn everything into high sample rate DSD. I'm not entirely sure why they thought it was good to have the PCM or the DSD oversampling. My guess is the chip allowed them to do it, so they kept it in there. But honestly, I think it's a little bit redundant. These DACs are clearly superior sonically when running in non-oversampling mode. The oversampling process is being done by a basic chip, and therefore it kind of detracts, in my opinion, from the benefits of the R2R processing. So what's happening is the signal comes in, it goes through a chip, and then it comes back out to the R2R circuit. That chip processing, for me, pulls a bit of the magic away from the sound that these DACs can produce. On my very, very first listen using the oversampling, for a moment I thought I preferred it, but it was one of those situations where there's a bit of extra grain and a bit of harshness added to the sound that initially can trick our ears into thinking it's pulling out a little bit more detail. But on further listening, what I found was it was obscuring some of the subtle textural and timbral or tonal information, and overall the R2R circuit, when left in non-oversampling mode, produces a much more realistic and organic sound. So for my money, Holo Audio could have completely left out oversampling as an option and it wouldn't have made any difference at all. But it's in there if you want to play with it. While we're talking about oversampling and sonic differences and things like that, let me cover off two other general sound quality comments before I get into detail about the Spring and the May with some comparisons. The first thing I want to talk about is that whether I was using the XLR or the RCA outputs from either DAC, the differences were basically indistinguishable. And I say basically because I never like to be absolutely definitive in saying it's absolutely indistinguishable, but it was close enough when taking into account the different characteristics of XLR connections versus RCA connections. It was close enough using identical cables except for those plugs that I wouldn't want to say that they're not identical. Maybe there's a very slight difference, but it's not enough to get hung up about. So if you wanted to buy either of these and run them into two different amps, one with XLR, one with RCA, you're going to be getting identical performance in my opinion. That's always really nice to see because there are some DACs on the market where the balance is clearly superior to the RCA, but that's not the case here, which is fantastic. The final thing I want to mention is that when some of the channel patrons heard that I had the Holo DACs in-house, they asked me if I'd try them specifically with upsampled audio from an external source. And so I tried the May and the Spring running the exact same tracks, but being upsampled by a Volumio Primo, and I've got a review on that one coming soon. It's a brilliant little streamer. So the Primo was taking it from a 44.1 or 48 or 96 kilohertz file, whatever the standard files were, and upsampling them to 768 kilohertz. And what I found with both DACs was that the sound became a little bit more spacious and even a little bit smoother, not meaning lacking detail or texture, but just more refined when running the upsampled signal. So if you do have a convenient way to feed these with upsampled audio, they perform even better with that. It's not a deal breaker where I'd say you absolutely have to send at higher sample rates, but it does seem to benefit from receiving high sample rate audio. And that gives me quite a nice segue into now talking about the sound quality of the Spring KTE and the May KTE. For all of this testing, I was not using any upsampling, so this is kind of the standard, normal levels of quality. I was running USB inputs and BNC inputs, depending on what I was testing at the time, but a mixture of USB and BNC with whatever the native sample rate of the file was. As I tend to always do when I'm running comparisons like this, I started at the bottom and worked my way up, so I could see what improvements you get as you step up through the price levels. And that means that my first test was putting the Holo Spring KTE up against the Schiit Yggdrasil. So this is the current OG version. I've got the review coming very soon. And the reason I put these up against one another is they both use a version of R2R of sorts. The Spring is a true ladder DAC, whereas the Schiit multi-bit DACs, like the Yggy, do the processing in a chip. The other reason I put these side by side is that the Spring has a price tag of $3,098 US as a non-preamp unit, and the Yggy is a bit over $2,000 US depending on the variant you get. So you've got nearly $1,000 between the two, and I was interested to see if stepping up from the Yggy to something like the Spring was a worthwhile step. What I found as I jumped between a series of different tracks was that they are very similar DACs overall. But what I found was the Yggy just has a bit more clarity and detail in the top end. The Spring to me comes across just a little bit muted, a little bit held back in comparison to the Yggy. One of the tracks I used for this testing was Don't Matter Now by George Ezra. On this track, the Spring 3 came across fuller and richer sounding, particularly down in the bass. It had kind of a fuller, more solid and weighty bass, whereas the Yggy, on the other hand, came across a bit tighter in the bass. I found that as the track got busier, particularly through the chorus for instance, the Yggy was able to do a better job at extracting details out of the mix. I could hear more individual stuff going on in the Yggy than I could from the Spring. In the Spring, there are a few percussive elements going on that actually get lost. When I listened to it on the Yggy, I could clearly hear them. When I went back to the Spring, even knowing that they were there, it was hard to pick them out of the mix. So for me, the Yggy's definitely doing a better job with the overall detail resolution, detail extraction, whatever you want to call it. Listening to the horns and the vocals in those choruses, everything gets a bit clustered, a bit kind of clumped together on the Spring, whereas I felt like the Yggy managed to pull them apart and separate them better. I was quite surprised by this. I didn't expect the Yggy to be the better DAC here, but to my mind, it's doing a better job on both a technical level, but also an enjoyment level too. On poorer recordings and on headphones that are naturally resolving and revealing and neutral, like something like the Susvara, the Yggy can sometimes get a little bit dry, but it's more of a reflection of the recording and not so much the DAC. Across the entire range of music that I tried, the Yggy was more consistently enjoyable, whereas I felt like the Spring constantly was just over smoothing things a little bit. It wasn't extreme, it wasn't to the point of something like the Denafrips Aries 2, where I felt like everything was just blunted and lacking in energy, but it didn't quite have the attack and the engagement from the Spring that I was getting from the Yggy. And so for me, after putting these two side by side, I really felt like the Spring is a bit overhyped. I think for over $3,000 you can save yourself nearly $1,000 and buy yourself an Yggy and get better sound. Now, of course, the Yggy doesn't have a preamp built in, but you could easily go out and buy yourself a Singer SA1 or a Burson Soloist 3XP, and suddenly you've got an incredible preamp and an incredible headphone amp, and you've spent still about the same or even less than what the Spring costs. So for me, the Spring was a little bit of a disappointment. It's a beautiful sounding DAC. I'm not meaning for a second to say it's not a great sounding DAC. It's got a beautiful, rich, warm, smooth sound. The preamp that's built in, if you pay the extra $600, is an exceptionally good preamp. But the sound quality for me doesn't quite match up to the hype, or more importantly, match up to the price tag. Something else I should mention that is a bit of a problem is that both the May and the Spring have extremely hot outputs. What I mean by that is that the balanced output from these is at 5.3 volts. Now the industry standard is about 4 volts, so you're significantly higher than that, and that means that the starting point for your volume range is already much higher when you're using these DACs. If you've already got an amplifier that's got limited volume range, you're now in lots and lots of trouble if you add to it a Spring or a May. In the case of the Spring, you can use the preamp module if you're happy to spend $600 more to pull that back a bit, but as I've already said, I'd much rather save that money, buy myself an Yggdrasil, and have an industry standard 4 volt balanced output. It means you've now got better volume range available, and it happens to sound better. So for me, the Spring is a disappointment. I don't believe the hype train is a good hype train to jump on board. And for me, it's not a DAC I would recommend, not because it's a bad DAC by any stretch, but because there's better options available for less money. And so with all that in mind, let me now give you some context as to how the May compares by stepping up in price, splitting the circuit, and separating the power supply. Comparing the Spring and the May, it was immediately evident that the May is a much more resolving DAC. The timbral and tonal qualities of everything was much more accurate, much more lifelike and realistic. There was none of that sense of smoothing anything over. It was just a joy to listen to the May. One of the tracks I used for this comparison was The Maker by Daniel Lanois, and once again I heard that muted characteristic from the Spring when listening to the drums in The Maker. The May did no such thing, but the Spring felt like it was just holding everything back from the drum kit in terms of its life, its energy, its texture and its detail. The May produces a wider and generally more expansive soundstage than the Spring, and he was also showing me textures in Daniel Lanois' voice that again weren't present from the Spring. The Spring just doesn't quite get those fine details and those textural cues that something like the Yggy and now the May are able to extract. As I said before, in terms of the scale of R2R DACs, having heard something like the Aries 2, I definitely think the Spring sits above the Aries 2, but it's still not a great choice of a DAC in my opinion. The May, on the other hand, shows you what R2R is really capable of when it's done right. And as much as I would love to be giving you comparisons right now to things like the Pontus or the Venus or the Terminator from Denafrips, I haven't yet got my hands on those. So do stay tuned. I intend to get around to reviewing those at some point, but I can't yet give you that comparison. For now, as I've already covered off, I'm not going to recommend the Spring, but at this stage I was very encouraged by the fact that the May was clearly a big step up from the Spring. And so I thought I'd quickly put the May up against the Yggy to see how they compared. And now what I was hearing was kind of the same differences that separated the Yggy and the Spring were now separating the May from the Yggy, but this time it was the May that was better than the Yggy. And you'd definitely expect that when spending double the money. So remember, we're now going from a bit over $2,000 all the way up to $5,500 or just over $5,500. So you'd expect the May to perform better, and it does, thankfully. In addition to extracting more detail, the May also comes across as being more timbrally accurate. In other words, instruments to me sound more like they should. Not that the Yggy is unnatural, but the May is uncannily realistic. To give you some specific details, one of the tracks I listened to was I Miss You by Randy Newman. On this track, the harmonics from the piano being played by Randy Newman were much more evident on the May. It was like you could hear the full expanse of harmonics, keeping in mind that pianos create lots and lots of resonance from the body, not just the note that the string's playing. And it was like you could hear all of that from the May, whereas on the Yggy, you could hear a lot of it, but it didn't feel quite as much like you were hearing all of it. From the May, I could hear more texture from the strings in the orchestra, whereas this time it was the Yggy that actually sounded a little bit muted. Not muted in the same way that Spring did, but not quite as detailed and textured and transparent as the May was sounding. There was a greater sense of three-dimensionality from the May, and layering and depth in the soundstage was also stronger. What that also meant was that the separation of sounds was excellent on the May, and things were generally created with a better sense of space around them, and as I've already mentioned, that sense of three-dimensionality, presence and weight within the soundstage. That's a characteristic I've always found the Schiit DACs to do really well, and something I personally really appreciate. And it was great to hear a DAC like the May take that even further. One thing that did go in the favour of the Yggy here was that I felt like it brought the vocals a bit closer to me, and it was a little bit smoother overall, probably because it wasn't pulling out quite as much detail, but it did make for a very intimate and engaging vocal. I'm not suggesting that makes it better than the May, but I can imagine some people actually liking the sound of the Yggy better than the May in some cases, but that's going to come down to system synergy and musical tastes. There's no doubt in my mind that the May is clearly the superior DAC, as it should be. And so having determined that the May is not all hype and it is the real deal, I decided to put it up against another DAC that we already know is the real deal in the Chord TT2. In order to make sure there was a level playing field, just comparing the DAC stages on these two, because the TT2 has its own amplifier, I ran both of these using BNC cables in with identical cables, and then I ran outputs using identical XLRs from both into the soloist GT. So the GT was the consistent amplifier, meaning that I was only listening to the DAC. And I have to say, listening to just the TT2 with no M scaler, the sound from these two was very, very similar. Which is not to say the same, but they definitely have similarities. One of the tracks I tried for this was Thankful by Johnny Lang and Michael McDonald, and some of the things I noticed was that the TT2 is a bit more forward and energetic in its presentation. I found that the May's presentation was a little bit less intimate, and so by pulling the soundstage away from me as the listener, what it was doing was it was giving a greater sense of space. It's not to say that both DACs don't produce a good sense of space. It was more that if there's the same amount of overall space in the soundstage, one of those spaces is placed closer to you in the TT2 versus the whole soundstage being moved back a little bit in the May KTE. I felt like the May produced a slightly smoother sound, whereas the TT2 had just a slight edge on texture and detail retrieval. Overall, both were excellent DACs. Switching back and forth between the two, it was pretty much impossible to say which one was better, because it did depend a lot on the track I was listening to. Listening to Thankful, both DACs had their benefits. On the TT2, I could really hone in on Johnny Lang and Michael McDonald, their vocals and the qualities of their vocals, the differences of them. Whereas with the May, with that slightly further away presentation, I felt like there I was able to hear more of the overall expanse of the music and not so much get pulled into the vocals. Neither experience is automatically better or worse, they're just different presentations. And that's where I do think it's important for us to put into context what we're talking about with the May and what we're talking about with the TT2. Because I have seen some reviews claiming that this is the better DAC than the TT2, and I'm not going to dispute that directly because it is very much at the point where it's going to come down to subjective and personal preference. Both of these are outstanding DACs. Where things get a bit tricky though, is that for your $5,000 odd US, with the May, you are getting a DAC. With the TT2, you're getting a DAC and an incredibly good headphone amp. When I tried a similar setup, but now using the May with the Soloist GT, and then using the TT2 all on its own, now all of a sudden the TT2 pulled ahead. Listening through the TT2's internal amp, everything was even more spacious and more live. And that's up against an incredibly good headphone amp in the Soloist. But the TT2 is just nuts as an all-in-one because the signal path from the DAC to your headphones is tiny and super simple. When you're using something like the May, you have to go from the May's output stage into a pair of XLRs via various connectors, into the headphone amp, through the headphone amp, out the other end and into your headphones. So there's lots more pieces to the puzzle, and every one of those connections and components that you're passing through has the potential to reduce the detail and the transparency of the end result. And as incredibly good as the Soloist GT is, and as incredibly good as the May is, the end result from the TT2 with its internal headphone amp, and we're not talking about the M scaler yet, the difference just from the TT2 and its internal amp was for me a better overall sonic experience. Now subjectively, there will be some that still like the tonal characteristics and presentation of the May, but keep in mind you've then got to buy yourself an amplifier that brings it to the same level of performance. And I'm not quite sure how much you'd have to spend to get yourself there. To give you some solid data to work with there, the TT2 on its own is $5,500 and that's giving you, as I've already said, a top tier DAC and a top tier headphone amplifier all in one very compact device. On the other hand, the May is $5,500 for the DAC itself, or just a little bit over. And then by the time you add something like the Soloist GT, you've now spent yourself just over $8,000, and it's still, in my opinion, not quite as good as the TT2. It's an exceptional system, and it's something that I would recommend if the TT2 didn't exist, but the maths for me don't quite stack up. The TT2 is saving you $3,000 by not requiring you to buy a top tier amplifier. On top of that, it's also taking up so much less space, both vertically but also horizontally, compared to the May. Now, of course, if space isn't an issue, and if you've already got the rest of your system in place, maybe you've got your amp, you've got your headphones or your speakers, in that situation, having the amplifier within the TT2 might be completely irrelevant. And if that's the case, then I would absolutely recommend the May or the TT2 as being completely and utterly on the same level with slight sonic differences. The May being ever so slightly richer and smoother, but ever so slightly, and the TT2 extracting just a little bit more detail and having a little bit more neutrality to it. But again, very, very slight differences. The final piece to the puzzle for me though was that you can then add the M scaler to the TT2. Once you add the M scaler, you've spent yourself about $10,300. So it's now more than buying a great amplifier and the May here, and so I was curious to see just how much better it might be than what I'd already described. For this test, I was listening to Picture in a Frame by Tom Waits, and as soon as the track started with the opening piano passage, what I could hear from the M scaler was much more of the room and the resonance and just a general sense of ambience that wasn't as clear from the May. Layering of the soundstage and three-dimensionality was stronger from the TT2 and the M scaler, and the May's already great there, but the TT2 and the M scaler are just exceptional. From the TT2 M scaler combo, I also found that Tom Waits' voice, the texture in his voice, and then the saxophone and the texture and the timbre of that were also clearer and more natural. And I'm not for a second here suggesting the May isn't great. I'm just trying to put it into context as to how great it is and what might be better. I did find that the May provided a greater sense of weight in the vocals, which no doubt some people might prefer, but it was coming at the cost of a little bit of texture and a sense of extra detail. To me, the May is a lovely, wonderful sounding DAC, but it's just not on the same level as the TT2 and the M scaler. And I probably should add at this point, in case anyone thinks there's any bias or prejudice towards or away from one of these products, that I actually really wanted to love the May, and I do love the May, but my point being, there's a part of me that enjoys trying new things, changing up my gear, and as much as I like to continue with gear that I love, I'm always open to the next thing. And a part of me was really looking forward to possibly selling off the TT2 and the M scaler and keeping the May and the Soloist GT as my new reference setup. But in reality, there's no way I'm parting with the M scaler and the TT2 because it hasn't been bested yet. There's no doubt that some people are going to prefer, particularly depending on the system that you might already have that this is going to be slotting into. There might be people that prefer the slightly warmer and ever so slightly richer sound of the May. Again, it's not a hugely warm and thick sounding DAC or anything like that, but it does smooth things over a little bit more than something like the M Scaler and TT2. But on the flip side, the detail and the texture and the clarity that the TT2 and the M Scaler provide while still being smooth is just unparalleled for me so far in my journey. Now, there's definitely more expensive DACs out there. There's the DCS Bartok that I want to try one day, and no doubt a whole bunch of others that I need to get to. I mentioned before things like the Denafrips Terminator. So I'm not saying the TT2 and the M Scaler is the best thing in the world, but it still remains the best thing I've heard. Where this leaves us for this review is with the following final conclusions. The Spring KTE, in my opinion, is not a DAC that I'd recommend. It's a lovely DAC, it's beautiful, the preamp in it is fantastic, the sound it makes when you're changing volume is wonderful. You almost wanted to sit there with the button held down and hear it go click, 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 click. But for $3,600 US, I don't think it's money well spent. And I personally would recommend the Yggdrasil. So do stay tuned for that review if you're in the market for a DAC at that level. Moving up to the May, if you've already got all of your amp systems set up and you're just looking for a DAC, the May is absolutely gorgeous and stellar. I would absolutely recommend it as a standalone DAC. But if you're then going to need to buy yourself a headphone amplifier, or you're in a position where you're going to spend more in the future and something like an M Scaler being added to the mix is a potential, then I still think the TT2 and the M Scaler is the better choice. The May is clearly and easily one of the very, very best DACs I've ever heard, but it's still not the best. If you're craving a slightly smoother and richer sound for your system, then the May still have a place. But I think it's worth knowing that in choosing the May, you are trading off a little bit of texture and detail, some of those subtle harmonic and sort of room spatial cues. The May does fall a bit short of that compared to an absolute flagship level system like the TT2 and M Scaler. And so I want to say thank you once again to Hugo from Indie Hi-Fi for sending these out for me to try. I do think they're incredibly made DACs. They're absolutely great examples of what R2R can do. But for me, it's the May that I would recommend, and the Spring I would say there's better options for less money. Hopefully you found this review useful. Hopefully I've either saved you some money or sent you in the right direction for the money that you're going to spend. And if I have, if you've enjoyed this video, please think about hitting subscribe and like. Don't forget to share some reviews from the channel as far and wide as you can to help us hit that 20,000 subscriber goal so I can give away the SMSL stack. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.